hi, and some more signposting to use to help you navigate and guide people through your speaking. Signposting is what we use to help people understand where are we going with this conversation. And if you're a manager or a leader or somebody who has to do presentations, you really should be using signposting to help your listeners know where we're going. So here are some helpful phrases that will make you stronger at communicating. To start off, let's explore. To start off, let's explore. Firstly, I'd like to address. To introduce a topic, you could use, firstly, I'd like to address. I'd like to suggest we explore. Let's begin by discussing. To transition to a new point. Moving on to the next section. Now, let's consider. Shifting our focus to. When you are providing an example. For instance, to illustrate this point. An example of this is when you need to acknowledge a counter argument. However, it is important to consider. On the other hand, some may argue that. Agree or disagree. I agree with this perspective because. I agree with this perspective because. While I see your point, I would argue that. While I see your point, I would argue that. I share a similar view, but. Notice that when you are agreeing or disagreeing, you do need to keep your inflections. Dropping your voice down will sound more serious. I agree, but. You can hear that using different inflection has a different sort of feeling to it. And so keeping it friendly would be, I agree, but. Okay, you can hear the difference. Use your inflections to communicate what you're feeling and thinking. When you want to conclude or wrap up a conversation or a discussion. To conclude our discussion. Let's wrap up by. Before we move on, and to get feedback. What are your thoughts on this? Do you have any opinions on this matter? I'd like to hear your perspective on this. I'd like to hear your perspective on this. So, I hope those phrases help and you can practice them and use them to be a better communicator, and it will give you a bit of fluency. And instead of finding yourself stuck, not knowing how to transition, go for it. Use signposting. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you think and what you need help with. Right. See ya. Bye, guys.